Philip Hibbs. I'm an occupational hygienist and I'm based in Australia on the East Coast. Look, asbestos was mined and in use in Australia from like the 30s and 40s onwards, and the asbestos industry developed and it was used quite extensively, particularly in asbestos cement sheet building products, and particularly after the war. And then asbestos, well, we had the Wittenoom asbestos mine in Western Australia, which is the famous blue asbestos mine. There's got a very serious cohort of mesotheliomas that has come out of the mine. Or the mine workers, I should say, and that closed in the mid to late 60s, and then there were white asbestos mines on the east coast of Australia, and they closed sort of around about the same time. And asbestos manufacturing ceased in Australia in the mid 70s, and then we progressed from an asbestos manufacturing industry to an asbestos removal industry, which has matured over the last 25 years, and we are still pulling asbestos out of buildings and residential houses across the country. Look, it was used very extensively, as I said, particularly bonded asbestos cement products were used very extensively, not only in commercial facilities but also in residential facilities. But there was also friable asbestos materials that were used extensively in commercial and industrial applications. But on the east coast of Australia, in New South Wales and Canberra, there was a group called Mr. Fluffy that used raw asbestos fibre sprayed into the ceilings of houses, residential properties, as insulation. I suppose it depends on how you view it, because it wasn't illegal at the time that he did it. It was just unfortunate that he used asbestos. Yeah, they were probably selling it as the best product to use. That it, it's not going to have rodents in it. It's not going to have it's fire resistant. It's going to have great insulation properties. So it wasn't illegal at the time. It's just really unfortunate that it's happened, because then it's left a great legacy and a very expensive legacy to clean up. Australia is like 7 little countries federated under one Commonwealth government. So we've got 7 states and territories federated under the Commonwealth government. Each state and territory is responsible for its own whole series of legislative components, but particularly the health and safety and environmental legislation. So it's different across the entire country. Since the early 80s, we've been trying to develop and implement harmonised legislation for WHS across the country. We've managed to get it into a number of states, but not all of them. So initially, the legislation in each of the states was geared towards an asbestos manufacturing industry, and it slowly has evolved to adopt an asbestos abatement or management and abatement industry. The exposure standards are currently published through Safe Work Australia through their website, but initially it is legislated in each of the state government work health and safety legislation. And certainly when I started in the industry, it was 4 fibres per millilitre of air. That, mind you, that's quite a long time ago. And now we have an 8-hour TWA of 0.1 fibres per millilitre of air, but they have action limits that are much lower than that, and the action limit's actually set at 0.01, and with a SOP work action limit at 0.02. And I think that's adopted pretty well across the country. Well, given that the the method for assessment of airborne respirable asbestos fibres in Australia is currently the membrane filter method with analysis by phase contrast microscopy, and the nominal detection limit for the usual sampling parameters is 0.01 fibres per mil. I don't think it can't go below that at the moment, unless there's a radical change in the way we conduct those measurements, or the method that we use to conduct those measurements. It's not specified in all of the legislation, but they generally favour polarised light microscopy supplemented with dispersion staining. Look, it may well do, because there are limitations associated with polarised light microscopy, insofar that there are 6 regulated asbestos types. It can only unequivocally identify 3 of the 6 asbestos types. The other 3, so it can unequivocally identify chrysotile, crucidolite and amosite. The other 3, actinolite, tremolite and anthophyllite, it can identify them as asbestos types, but it can't distinguish between the 3 of them. So we can unequivocally identify 3 types, and then we can identify the other 3 types as an unknown mineral fibre. It's a performance-based assessment specified in the state legislation, but essentially maintaining the materials in good condition and undisturbed, and while they remain in good condition, stable and undisturbed, they don't release measurable numbers of airborne respirable asbestos fibres. But there is a requirement to have an asbestos management program in place for buildings constructed before 2004, I think it is. So that the materials are inspected to identify where they are. They are labelled, and then there's a system in place to monitor their condition on a periodical basis, maximum of 5 years, to ensure that they are in good condition and they remain undisturbed. Buildings are to be refurbished or demolished, then there has to be a different type of survey undertaken. Currently, there's a fair degree of commonality between the legislation across the country in this regard, that for buildings that are to be retained, they require an asbestos survey to identify the asbestos containing materials and assess their condition, and then an asbestos management program to be developed for their in-situ management, and if they're deteriorated or otherwise pose a measurable risk to the occupants, then there's a requirement to remove them. But the materials are labelled and then managed in situ. But in the situation where there is a refurbishment proposed or demolition of the building, then there is to be another survey, an identification survey, which is a bit more invasive than a survey done for a qualitative risk assessment and risk management. A more invasive survey is done to, where possible, identify all the asbestos containing materials in the building, and then they are to be removed before they are disturbed by either the refurbishment or the demolition. There is currently no, it's not specified how the survey is to be done. It just specifies it's to be done by a competent person, and it's to identify the asbestos containing materials, but there is no procedure for doing it as such. There are a number of groups that cover this in the area, like there is there's the Faculty of Asbestos Management of Australia and New Zealand, and I'll declare my position there because I'm on the board. We are working towards developing standardised procedures. There's also the Asbestos and Hazardous Materials Consultants Association in New South Wales. They're looking at doing similar types of things, and there's the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists as well. I don't want to call anything a scandal. I'd rather refer to because like with Mr. Fluffy, for instance, that's a tragedy rather than a scandal because it was not illegal. They didn't do anything that was illegal, so they just used what they believed to be the best product at the time, and that was unfortunate that had happened. But the other, some of the other tragedies, for instance, we mentioned Wittenoom before. That was a tragedy insofar that it was operating well into the 60s, and that they knew the association between exposure to particularly fibrous rubricide or crucidolite, blue asbestos, and mesothelioma, and there had been warnings issued by medicos at the health department in WA, and yet they were not acted on. The reason that mine closed in the end it was based on the fact that it became no longer commercially viable. It had nothing to do with the mining of blue asbestos being unpopular or anything. It became commercially unviable. Look, I think there's a degree of commonality universally. I think that the management of asbestos and the removal of asbestos in Australia, so the in-situ management and the removal has matured dramatically over the last 25 plus years. I think there are always improvements that we could make. There are some issues with the current legislation where they could be improved upon, but I'd say that that we're actually heading towards managing it pretty well in both the removal side of things and in situ management. Look, I don't know that it's particularly helpful to make comparisons between, because although I'm not exactly sure what they do on the continent. I'm a little, because of work that I've done in Italy, I'm a little bit aware of what happens there, and in the US and in the UK. But it's not an area that I'm particularly comfortable on commenting on, other than sort of making some I don't want to make any value judgments. I think we do it reasonably well. I think the UK does it extremely well. They've also, the British Occupational Hygiene Society established their faculty of asbestos assessment and management. That group is slightly more mature than FAMANS in Australia, and they are setting standards at the very highest level. We're aiming to get to that level as well, and they manage things reasonably well in the US also. Our ultimate objective is the removal of asbestos from from all their buildings and from and all structures, and have it safely buried back in the ground where it came from. That isn't going to happen overnight. That's going to take a very long. It took us, sort of 50 to 100 years to put it into the buildings. It's going to take us another, 50 odd years to get it out. And it's a matter of cost as well, because it's expensive the removal process is expensive, and it's quite often conducted in conjunction with demolition or refurbishment of buildings. It's going to take a long time to do that. We need to manage the materials effectively in situ. The publications by Safe Work Australia acknowledge that, and they set standards for requirements of management. In situ management, they also have requirements for removal. The progression, the industry will continue to mature. I think that the amount of friable asbestos in society is steadily decreasing, and the number of friable jobs that occur now are a lot less than what they were 25 years ago. The asbestos cement, the removal of asbestos cement will continue to progress over the next 20 to 30 years. It'll certainly see me out. I won't still be here. Look, there's through areas in Melbourne and in Western Sydney, they refer to it as the fibro belt, because there are whole suburbs that the houses are clad with asbestos cement sheet on the outside, roofs and walls, and internally. Now, while those materials remain stable and in good condition, they don't pose a measurable risk to the occupants, but ultimately, through either refurbishment or demolition and replacement of the structure, it will be removed. there is the Australian Mesothelioma Register. They publish these stats through Safe Work Australia. As I understand, the mesothelioma death rate has plateaued, and it is probably going to start to decline going forward. It is not rising any further. But we're talking about over sort of the last 50 plus years, thousands of people that have been impacted by asbestos-related diseases that primarily came out of the asbestos mining, manufacturing and usage industries, but very likely the next cohort of workers that we see with asbestos-related diseases will come from the removal industry. The membrane filter method counts objects on the filter that conform to certain size criteria. They may be asbestos and they may not be. But essentially anything that's longer than 3 microns, thinner than 3 microns and has an aspect ratio of greater than 3 to 1 is counted, be it asbestos or not.